Hi everyone. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at scheduling our planting. And this is going to be a pretty quick lecture, but what I wanted to go over is some ideas and some tips and some things to think about when you are trying to plan out when you should start your flowers or vegetables or shrubs or whatever you're growing. So there's a couple things that you need to think about, right, and be aware of. First is, what are you growing? Right, your different plants are going to have different characteristics, different tolerances for temperature. That's typically what we're thinking about when we're thinking about when we're growing. You need to be aware of, are you growing these for sale, right? So when are people going to be buying whatever you're growing, right? There's usually a hot time for when people are looking for spring bedding plants versus poinsettias or mums, etc. How are you going to be growing your plants? Are you direct seeding them in a field? Are you growing straight out into the field, like maybe like a home garden? Or are you starting your seeds indoors and later transplanting them? And then where you are located. Again, when we are talking about timing of growing, a lot of times we are talking about temperature, as we'll look at, and where you are located in the world or in the United States or even in New Jersey is going to impact when you can start your planting here. So in order to start answering these questions and getting an idea of when we want to start growing, there's some general steps that we can follow, or at least that I follow, that I find to be helpful. Right, so again, we start with identifying our plant traits. What types of plants are we growing? Are they cool versus warm season? Can they tolerate a frost? Can they not? Do they tolerate being transplanted? And that's going to start helping us when we figure out when our date is that we want to plant them. We kind of work backwards, as we'll see. So you identify your plant traits, you identify how you're growing them, right? Outdoors versus indoors. If you're growing indoors, essentially you can pretty much start whenever, especially if you have like artificial lighting. So that kind of alleviates all of this. But you are going to be growing outdoors or transplanting outdoors, you need to be aware of that. Again, that idea of if you're growing it for sale or consumer demand, that is going to dictate some of when you are planting, because you may want to have your plants ready for sale by some date that maybe if you are like a wholesale producer, right, and you are selling your plants to a nursery, you're going to want to know when that nursery expects to have those plants to be then ready for sale to the market. And then, so again, these are things I'm working through: what I'm growing, where I'm growing it for myself or for sale. You then want to identify, like I said, your local climate and your plant growing season. And particularly, especially when we're timing things, we're often looking at the last and the first frost date, right? So the last date of frost in spring and the first date of frost in fall. And then based on all those things, you determine how long it's going to take your plant to be ready for sale or transplant or direct seeding, if we're doing that. And then you work backwards in time. So essentially what you do is you find the date that you want your plant to either be ready for sale or to be planted in the ground. And then based on its traits and how you're growing it, you work backwards to determine the time of when to actually start it. And I'll go over an example at the end of this lecture here. So in that first step that I have there, it's identify plant traits. Kind of the important thing, important traits to think about are whether they are cool or warm season plants, right? Can they tolerate a bit of a frost? Do they need warmer, much warmer temperatures, right? Can't tolerate any frost whatsoever. And then whether they can be transplanted or direct seeded, right? For your plants that can, if they cannot tolerate a frost, they would have to be started a little bit later in the spring. But if they can be transplanted, you can start the seeds indoors, let them grow to a certain size, and then once the danger of frost has passed, you can then transplant them. Right, so that's important considerations there. And there are a couple of resources that I have listed here that can help you in identifying plant traits, and there's going to be a few more as we go through the lecture, but I'll just click on some of these to let you see them. Cornell has a really good home gardening website that you see here, so it has both flowers and vegetables, so we'll click on both real quick. But if you go, it has a number of vegetables, and then we'll pick, let's see, we'll go to broccoli. So there's a number of vegetables, and then it gives you a lot of information on them, including the site characteristics of where they should be grown, some of their plant traits, important stuff that we talked about, and any special considerations. All right, so broccoli is our cool season crop, so we know that it can tolerate a little bit of frost, so we'd be able to plant this a little bit earlier, especially if we are planting this inside, which we can with broccoli because it can be transplanted. So you can read about it here. You can come down here, it tells you, gives you some growing information such as how to plant, propagating by seed, how long it takes to emerge, germination temperatures, etc. Right? And this will even provide you information on when to sow seeds if you are sowing them indoors. So for example, with broccoli here, we know it's cool season, we know it can tolerate a little bit of frost. They recommend you would start your seeds about 6 to 8 weeks before that average last spring frost. And then you can transplant them outside when they're about 4 to 6 weeks old, right? So a little bit before you would expect. There may be a frost still, but it's most likely you're kind of out of that window. But because they can tolerate a little bit of frost, you can start them a little bit earlier. So this is the Cornell website that I think is pretty useful. Oh, you know, when I go back, it always does this. And while I'm at it, we can look at these some of the Rutgers things, right? This is more for vegetable gardening, but again, it gives you information on species and planting dates, etc. And whether this is a little bit more important, whether you need to grow them by seed or if you can transplant. And then let me see what our last one is as well, since I have it on there. Vegetable seeds indoors. Okay, again, this is probably going to give you information, great, on plant traits, their ability to transplant, and how long it takes for them to grow until they're ready for that transplanting stage. All right, let's go back. All right, so you're going to want to get some plant traits, and these are just 3 resources. There are lots around there, and I actually should have shown you the gardening. Besides vegetables for Cornell, they have flowers, so you can get information on flowers as well if you're interested in growing them. So once you have your plant traits down, right, you know kind of the range of temperatures that they can tolerate, whether they can tolerate a frost or not. Ideally, what you then want to know is your growing season for where you live. So your growing season is the period of the year in which temperature, sunlight, and rainfall are adequate for plant growth. And again, we're typically looking at temperatures when we're looking at growing season, at least where we are here in New Jersey. Right, in our growing season, there are different definitions for it. Some will define growing season as the period of time between the last and the first occurrences of 32 degrees, or a frost-free season. Some people will define it as a period of time between 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Regardless, it's the period of time in which your plants will be able to grow. And if we look at some information, we can see here that for most of our temperate region plants, they can grow between 4 degrees Celsius or 39 degrees Fahrenheit and 122 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And as we said, this is because most of our plants, or really most organisms, have a range of tolerance for environmental factors that they can tolerate, right? So for temperatures, our plants can grow anywhere from, this would be 4 degrees Celsius or 39 Fahrenheit, and this would be 50 degrees Celsius or 122. So in this region of temperature, they can grow. However, you know, there is often always some optimal temperature at which they grow best. So you start identifying what your growing season is for where you live. And like I said, probably the most important thing to look at when you are thinking about timing is the timing of the last frost date in spring and the first frost date in fall. Because it is frost, if we are starting early, it's frost that is going to be most likely to damage your plants. And frost damage will typically occur at nighttime, right, when the temperatures drop. And what is happening is that those freezing temperatures are forming ice crystals. The water is freezing within the plant cells, right, and they're forming ice crystals, and that's rupturing the plant cell membranes and walls and destroying the plant cells. We typically see frost damage as blackened leaves like this. We had last year in plant propagation, about halfway through the semester, we had to switch to online. And we had been growing a number of plants in our greenhouse. And then when we switched to online, I had to take all of those plants home with me. And I was able to set up kind of like a little, I didn't have a greenhouse, so I was able to set up kind of like a mini greenhouse that was working for a while, but it wasn't too effective. And we had a particularly cold night in, let's see, I'd taken them home sometime in April. And I came out the next morning and most of the plants had some sort of frost damage that you see here. So it is a common thing if you start too early, and it could damage your plants. Luckily, I was able to save a lot of them, but not all of them, right? We were growing corn, this type of dwarf corn in containers, and we had several bean varieties and some other stuff. I think I had carrots growing and stuff, and they got a little damaged in this because of that really cold night. So it's something that you definitely need to be aware of if you are thinking about when you're going to be starting your plants. And kind of as we saw when I looked at that the Cornell thing, when they talk about timing, they're also timing it in relation to the frost date. So where do you get information on your last frost date, right? Or your earliest frost date if you're talking about planting later on in fall? Well, there's a couple different resources for you that we will check out. So there are these vegetation impact freeze maps that I have the link right here. And these are pretty neat because you can select, now this data, it has current data that you see up here, so that would be these current season freezes. So this is letting you know when was the date of a freeze from 7/1 to 2/28. But then what I use is down here, these 32 degrees freeze climatologies. And this has collected data for several years on when is the median date of the last freeze if we're looking at spring. Right? So you can click on that, and then you can check out wherever you are. So let's see, school is probably somewhere like right around here, I think. So we're going to say we're in this yellow. So the median date of last freeze, which is the median, would be like the middle date, right, 50th percentile, is anywhere between April 21st and the end of April. Right, so if we're thinking about starting our plants and we know that our average last frost date, kind of an average last frost date is the end of April, well, we can then time from the end of April. But if we want to be a little bit more cautious, we can look at the late last freeze, right? So this is information on the last freeze that occurred over the course of these years. Right, and this is closer, you see, to the end of May. So there are times where we get a very, very cold snap towards the end of May, but it's rare. So again, if you want to be more cautious, that would be something to consider. But for the most part, you can get away with an earlier start date on average. So here's some information. Now, this only goes up to 2010, so it's a little bit older now. As our climate is changing, this is likely going to shift. So we do have some more up-to-date information, but it's not spelled out as nicely on this on the map that we have. So you can do, let me go back here, and let me go back to here. Rutgers has a weather network that they track temperatures at. So you can pull that up, right? And you can select different weather stations. Let's see. We will say, do they have anything in Vineland? There you go. Vineland. And you could select your chart type. So we'll say 30 days of data, and you can look at temperatures. And this will track the temperatures over the past 30 days, the minimum and maximum, right? And then average. So if you're looking at this minimum daily temperature, you could see, oh, it's still pretty cold, right? We're still in these daily minimums. We're still going below 32 degrees, so there's still that danger of frost. But you can use this and kind of track this and kind of help you start to identify when's the best day or when's that going to be that last frost-free day. If you take this information over time, right, if we collected this over time, we could get a lot of information on maybe whether this date is changing, etc. So there's that for you guys. And then if we go back to our PowerPoint now, we also can look at plant hardiness zones produced by the USDA. These are more important for perennials. Your hardiness zones are going to give you maps that show the minimum temperature, right? So if you are planting perennials and you want to know what can grow and what's going to be able to survive my winter, plant hardiness zones are really beneficial for that. But people have also used those and developed planting schedules for various hardiness zones as well, for non-perennials as well, right? And you'll see that sometimes on seed packets or information that you find online that, you know, for this hardiness zone, you would plant these plants at this time, etc. And I have some links there as well. So you can use all of that to get information on your last frost date. Or you can just use an old school method and say your last frost date is going to correspond with Mother's Day, right? I've heard that before as kind of like the old school. Just plan on your last frost date as being around Mother's Day, which is the second Sunday in May. And you can go from there, right? Makes it a lot easier. And I'll show you, that's essentially how I planned out mine when I'm going to show you when I planned out my garden. And then the last thing, again, we're trying to, if you are planting and trying to figure it out for you're growing your own garden or growing stuff that you're going to want to work outside, you want to do that by that frost date, right, or by that growing season. But sometimes if you're growing for sale, that schedule may be different. And again, that's going to be dictated by some market demands, right? So for that instance, it just changes the timing of when you are going to be growing. So instead of, say, we want to have some bedding plants, typically we would have them available at Mother's Day. Maybe you want to have them started earlier, or you get an order for them to be ready earlier. That is going to determine when you're going to start them, obviously, earlier then. So considerations, again, here I have more resources for you guys, right? But it's the same idea, where you identify your date of when you want your plants to be done, and then you work backwards. But again, for you guys, if you go to this link, this is particularly if you are growing indoors, this the UMass extension here, they have a lot of good resources. It's where I got that virtual grower, the virtual greenhouse that we looked at, right? That's something that you could use, and we were able to change our plant dates and then get a start date from that. But then there are also a number of guidelines and charts that they have down here for different species. So we'll go to some of them. Let me open these up. So we're looking at bedding plants or vegetable transplants, bedding plants. That's some good stuff that I've looked at. It has links to, like I said, general information. So if we go to here, here's a pretty good one. These are for a lot of our bedding plants. And what this breaks down is the crop name, whether it's an annual, perennial, some information about the seeds, their weight, whether you need to cover them, lighting, optimal germination temperatures, and then importantly, timing here, right? So if we're growing, let's see, let's pick something that I like. All right, we're growing carnations here, right? This is going to tell us stuff about its germination. It says this is the time it takes to sow until they're ready to transplant. And then in total time here, transplanting to flower. So the time until they're ready essentially for marketing. So if we are growing our carnations, we are going to start them in those larger trays. As you see up here, if you guys remember from our containers, they are recommending those 512 plugs. So those the trays that had all those individual little cells, right? 512 of them. So you would start them in then. And then they're going to grow for around a month until they're ready to be transplanted into finished trays, which are those 606 trays or those six-pack trays. Although, depending on the species, they recommend different things. So for our carnations here, they would say put them into 6-inch pots instead when they're flowering. So you would transplant at around a month, and then there's going to be several more weeks until they're flowering and ready for sale. So using this is just a guide that you can use. Again, if you're trying to time things, right? If you want your carnations to be ready by a certain date, you would have that date in mind, and then you're going to work backwards 10 to 14 weeks, right? And you're going to sow your seeds at that time, whatever it is. And that's the same for pretty much all of these species that you have here. Again, let's see. This is not what I wanted. But if you go back to the main link, there are, you can check out more. Let's see, maybe this is the one I wanted. Yeah, this is the one I wanted. So it has it for bedding plants, also for vegetables. Same idea, right? We looked at broccoli earlier. So it gives you information on the time it takes to get to a transplant stage. So here it would be 5 to 6 weeks. And then what's nice about this chart is it breaks it down by stage of the plant. And if you look down here, it tells you what the stage is, right? So stage 1 is when you're sowing it to radical emergence. So for broccoli, it's going to take about 2 days for that germination for the radical to emerge. Stage 2 is going to take 5 to 8 days, and that is radical emergence to cotyledon expansion, right? So now your seedling has germinated. Stage 3 is the growth of true leaves. So up here we had our seed, the radical emerges, the seedling starts to emerge, and you have the cotyledons, which are the seed leaves that are emerging. Here at around 21 or 17 to 21 days, you have the true leaves develop. And then at the end of stage 4 is you have the growth of your true leaves, and you are ready to transplant into your final container that you're going to now sell these out to the market. So again, more information for you guys, particularly helpful when we are growing seed for sale, right? This is to develop plugs that you are then going to sell to people for them to use and plant in their vegetable gardens. So that is the PowerPoint, right? The whole purpose of this was to just give you some ideas on what you need to be aware of when you are thinking about scheduling your plants, right? And the last thing I want to show you is just what I use for my own personal garden for this year. I just use an Excel sheet, right? And I think about what I want to grow, and I have some different companion plantings that I do, and I'm trying some funky things this year. But essentially, I collect that first step, right? I identify what I want to grow, and I get all the information that I can about the plants, and like planting depth, spacing, and then comments here is, essentially whether they can tolerate frost or not, or what is the ideal temperature for them, etc. So I do all of this information, and then when I'm trying to plan out when I'm going to start everything, I identify when is going to be my last frost-free day, or when's the date that I want to start actually having things in the ground, and then I work backwards from that, right? So I went pretty conservative, and I said May 15th is going to be my day that I am putting stuff into the garden, right? That's my last frost-free day, and then based on this, I then um, work backwards and identify when to start all of my plants, right? So, for example, if this is my last frost-free day, I'm going to start corn. I want to start that a little bit after, maybe a week after that last frost-free day to make sure it's not going to get colder anymore. So then the week after is when I'm going to start my corn again with the acorn squash and beans. I'm going to start them later as well, a little bit later, because I want to make sure they don't tolerate frost. I want to make sure it's warm enough for them. For stuff that I can seed indoors, I did the same thing where I identified when's the ideal time for them to be placed out in the field and then worked my way backwards. So I'm trying to grow peanuts this year, which will be interesting. I don't know if it's going to work. But peanuts require nice warm temperatures. So for our peanuts this year, I'm going to start them indoors May 15th, and they need a generally long growing season, so that's why I'm kind of iffy about it. But I can start them indoors May 15th, and then I'm going to transplant them out in June, and hopefully they work. But that's essentially it, right? You identify your last frost date, and then based on your plant traits, you could then figure out when you're going to sow them directly or if you're going to start them indoors. So sunflowers, right, you can plant them at the end of your last frost-free day. So I'm planting them right there on May 15th. So just some information. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys when you are thinking about either starting your own garden or if you are thinking about growing for sale. Stuff for you guys to consider as you work through all of that. So that is it. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you next time.